friends! Welcome to Bright Green Futures, Episode 6, Exploring Grief in Climate Fiction with author Renan Bernardo. I'm your host, Susan K. Quinn, and we're here to lift up stories about a more sustainable and just world and talk about the struggle to get there. Today, we're going to talk to Renan Bernardo, Nebula finalist author of science fiction and fantasy. Renan is from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and his stories appear in Apex Magazine, Podcastle, Escape Pod, Daily Science Fiction, and more, as well as being published in multiple languages, including German, Italian, Japanese, and Portuguese. I cannot wait to share Renan's stories with you. Renan, thank you so much for coming on the pod today.
Thank you for having me here, Susan. It's a great honor.
Oh, thank you. And this is not the first time we've done things together. As we were saying before the pod started, that we just have done a couple of things, including the Hope Punk panel, and we always have such great conversations. So I am very excited for today. And congratulations on being a Nebula finalist. I saw that you're the first Brazilian Nebula finalist.
Yes.
So that's exciting, and it just happened this last week, right?
Yes, last Thursday. Yeah.
So for our listeners, Renan's Nebula finalist story is a short biography of a conscious chair, and we'll put a link in the notes so you can find it online. And it's such an interesting point of view and beautifully written, as all your stories are. But it's not climate fiction, so we're not going to focus on your award-winning story today, but readers should definitely check it out. And I did notice that Conscious Chair has a thematic element of grief, something I see in several of your stories. And I just love how you give that grief all the room and honesty it deserves. The story we're going to focus on today is also thoroughly drenched in grief and healing, which I feel is just so important in storytelling about the climate. There's so much eco-grief that we're barely talking about that just sort of floats out there unacknowledged. And I feel so strongly that in order to heal the earth and our relationship with it, we're going to need a lot of healing ourselves. So this story that we're going to talk about is Shoreline of Oil and Infinity. And I believe you've got an excerpt for us.
Yes. So this is it was published in Escape Pod, and as Susan said, it's called A Shoreline of Oil and Infinity. She brushes off the excess of crusted oil from the bot, scanning her fingerprint to open its main compartment. A wave breaks on the shore, sprinkling on her face and the bot. Let's see what we have here. The tattooee whirs, almost purrs. She plucks out the cylindrical cell from its rounded back. More darkened water. She doesn't read the full report, but she can guess what it contains pretty well. Heavy metals, volatile organic compounds, hydrocarbons. All there is to know in Barra Nova's waters these days. Layers of oil expand across both sides of the straight shoreline, coating the once-gilded sand. Patches of darkness suffusing the air with the stink of hydrogen sulfide that in the past made the kids call that beach the coast of broken eggs. Andres kids. Victoria always thinks of them as her stepbrother's children, though not one of them was his by birth. Victoria tucks the tattooee's cell and the biomed packs into her backpack and passes it over her shoulders. Thank you, little one. And that samples report to what we have and update your graphs. She taps the tattooee's shell and it peeps, a strip of light gleaming blue along its surface. She sprays a water-sorbent dispersant solution over it and wipes away the oil smudges from the bots the best she can. Not enough. Never is. Oil impregnates everything, from the sand to the waters, from her tattoos to her grimy fingernails and her greased curly hair. At home, it isn't hard to find small patches besmirching the parquet flooring, breadcrumbs leading her back to the beach, back to her work. And if she could look, there would probably be oil within her soul too.
Ah, gosh. So good. So good. This story, as you say, was published by Escape Pod, which means it's available in text and audio for listeners. And I probably should have said this up front. The story is set in Saquarema. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly.
Yeah.
Great. A real town in Rio de Janeiro state that suffers from a future major oil spill with devastating consequences for the environment, including these tiny crustaceans, the tatui, who drill holes in the sand. And in your story are replaced by these bots, the ones that she's cleaning these oil stains off of, which is just there's such poetry in that whole image. I love it. But let's talk about the grief in this story. There's the loss of the pristine beaches, the loss of the real Tatooine. All that grief is mirrored in the main character's loss of her stepbrother, Andre. So, why do you think this theme of grief keeps calling to you in your stories? And what do you want your characters, and by extension, your readers, to find as they process through all these different kinds of grief?
I think that grief is an important and essential part of climate catastrophe. And I think that people will miss not only their dearest ones. Grief is not only related to death. And with climate change and all the tragedies that come with it, and I think that also people will miss places that will be no more. Maybe a beach that you used to go to, a shop where you used to buy groceries, and home, perhaps somewhere you have lived before, or not only that, but just places that you pass by, or people that you even don't know, but you saw those people coming and going. In the story, you can see that in the face of, in the form of the kids that disappear suddenly because their families go away, or the tourists because it is a touristy town, and in the story it is no more because the tourists have no more interest in this part because the beaches are polluted. So this is this is also grief, and this is present in climate tragedy. And I think climate fiction has to portray grief that way, because entire ways of living will be grieved, and not only places and people, but ways of living will be missed by people. So I like to show that in my characters and in my plots. And I believe this story has all of those, and they are summarized in the absence of the tatui, which is a real crustacean that lives on beaches. And when some environment is polluted, the tatui suddenly vanishes. So uh, here in Rio, I remember as a child seeing lots of those tatuis in the beaches around here, and then they suddenly started vanishing, and then nowadays it's very rare to spot one on the beach. So it's symbolic it's a crustacean that is symbolic, that I think that represents so well what's happening with the world.
It does really
Uh,
capture that. Like, we like to have cute little creatures around. We attach emotionally to cute little things. And I think your Tatooine in the story, where she brings it back as these little mechanical things that have purpose. They go out and they clean and they analyze and they do important things, but it's like she's trying to restore something that you can't restore without actually addressing the problem. There is no substitute, not really, for some of these things that we're going to lose. And I think sometimes people don't know what to do with that in reality, like in the real world. What do I do with the fact that I used to hike all the time when I was a kid in Yosemite, which is this beautiful national park in California. And now it's changing and it's not the same as when I was a kid. And, it's still there. You can still go and see some of the natural beauty or a lot of natural beauty, but it's threatened. And I think people don't really know how to grapple with that, how to give voice to it. And so like your story is so wonderful that way because it gives a tangible thing to it with a little tattoo. You're like, oh yes, I would miss that. That's, and it's a crustacean, which isn't like necessarily warm and fuzzy, but it's kind of cute and small and runs around and you can see how to attach to it. I feel like all your stories have such richness and depth of emotion in them. And that's something that jumped out at me at the very first story of yours that I read, which is When It's Time to Harvest, which was in the Imagine 2200 collection. And then also in what remains my favorite story of yours, which is Look to the Sky, My Love, in Solarpunk magazine, which is a very sad story, but also just wonderfully cathartic in the processing of the grief that goes on there. And so I really recommend people read these. But those two stories in particular bring grief back to kind of a healing level by the end, as does this one with Shoreline of Oil and Infinity. There's a little touch of healing at the end. And so I think you can kind of say that's the hopeful part there. But how do you, as a writer, how do you balance going to those dark depths of grief and the need for healing things that sometimes you cannot fix and you cannot change and still reach to that hopeful ending, which I think is what is different about hopeful climate fiction, is that we don't just leave you in the depths. We bring you back up to this is how we move through it. Is it difficult as a writer to do that? Or do you find it just happens with each story in its own way? Or tell me a little about your process there.
I think it varies depending on the story. And I rarely write complete dystopias where everything is dark and hopeless. I always try to convey some sense of hope and resilience and healing in my stories. And even with this Nebula finalist story, which is a fantasy story that has nothing to do with climate fiction, you can notice a touch of hope in the end. Mm-hmm. And even if it's a sad story, and even in that story that you mentioned, Look to the Sky, My Love, and that came out in Solarpunk magazine, it is a profoundly sad story about death, and you see that there is no way around it for the protagonist, but it ends with a touch of hope in the sense that the environment where the protagonist is in and the party and everything that's happening around him sort of feeds him with a kind of hope, or at least the realization that there will be some light for him at the end of the tunnel. There will be some light. There will be some hope. There is some healing, even if it's not present right now. And for my solarpunk and climate fiction stories, I think hope is essential, because without hope or healing, the story breaks. And it's the core of solarpunk for me is hope. And so it's what moves the protagonist forward, and also what makes the story make sense. And so, because if there is no hope, there is nothing worth fighting for. So I believe there is always something worth fighting for. This is true for the real world as well. So even if things are completely broken, I think the hope of picking up the pieces might be enough as a motivation. So I always try to see it somewhere, to put it some way in my stories, because I think I like reading stories that are bleak and dark and hopeless, but when I write stories that are dark in nature, it's very difficult for me to not put some hope there in some form.
Mm-hmm. And that's the power, I feel like, of your stories, is you're not afraid to go to those darker parts of the soul and the grief and the just the existential horror of some of this. And I think a lot of us get stuck there and don't know how to climb back out. And I think that really is, for your stories in particular, because they are so emotionally rich, and you find that way back to that hopeful, and it's earned. Those story endings are very there's no like easy outs or anything like that. It is so emotionally earned, that it is very cathartic. And taking people through that full cycle, um, I feel like that's the essence of what, as you say, your Solarpunk has to do that, because that's what it is. That's the essence of what those kinds of stories do. And it's why, I mean, why we even have this podcast, is because I think not everybody knows about those kinds of stories being out there, and they really can help with this difficult time that we're living in. So I love it. And I wanted to circle back once again to Shoreline of Oil Infinity, because there's a fantastic line in that story that I want to call attention to. One character says, "We have to occupy the evil places and make them good." And it is such a powerful statement. And I stopped literally in the story and went back and read that again, because I was like, oh my, this is good. And it does actually get repeated in the story, and the character kind of struggles with the idea of what that means. So can you tell me a little bit about what motivated that idea that we have to occupy the evil places and make them good? And what's the alternative to that? I guess that we abandon them. And why would you not do that?
All right, so I think that in the end, this idea of occupying evil places and making them good is part of a process of healing. And you sort of have to occupy spaces to bring them life, to make them kind of useful. And this idea comes from other contexts here in Rio that some people talk about, that meaning that people have to be present in some public spaces, maybe places that were abandoned by the state and the private sector, or places that there are a lot of crime. And so people say that you have to occupy these public spaces so crime won't happen anymore, or that place will be valued. And if people are present in these places where the state and the private sector don't care about, I think people have the power to change the meaning of that place. And people can use that space for something: recreation, maybe play games or taking a walk, and doing work to preserve it, like gardening, dealing with tall grass, or watering the flowers, cleaning up the street, doing those sorts of things. I think this is a practical good in a place that could be completely abandoned. And in the end, it's all about transformation. In the story, the kids have tried to transform the abandoned supertanker into something for them. And they turned it into a place of prayer, but also of fun. They created their adventures there. They tried to make it a place that contained meaning for them. And it was kind of a resurrection of a place that otherwise would be completely abandoned. And abandonment, I think it's something that will happen a lot with climate change. So it's something that people need to fight against abandonment, all kinds of abandonment. I'm talking about abandonment of places, but also of people, of communities, and environments, entire environments. And that's I think one of the things that I want to bring with this line. We have to occupy evil places and make them good. It's that. It's to prevent abandonments, prevent. It's like that. Victoria on the beach. The beach is completely polluted by oil, but she's there, even if alone or with her bots. She's there occupying that beach and making it a place that is not abandoned because she's there. She's there for it. She's there healing it somehow and doing something for it.
Oh, there's so much power in that. I'm my brain is just churning with ideas as you're talking, because you're hitting on so many different wonderful pieces. The whole idea of resurrection, of like how we have death, but then, like mushrooms will, come and restore. And there's a real cycle of life to that, where if you're not, you know, present through the whole, you can't stop at the death part. Death is not the end, it's the beginning of the next stage of the cycle. And we as humanity have been so disconnected from nature, having this sort of conquering attitude rather than integrating attitude, rather than that we're part of the cycle. We're breaking the cycles. We're breaking a lot of the planet. And I think it's really important for us to put ourselves back into the story of that birth, death, and rebirth kind of cycle, because then we can see that we're part of it. And another piece that I was thinking as you were talking was about, I feel very strongly that we ground where we are, like wherever you are on the planet, whether it's Brazil or America or France or wherever you are, there are things that need to be done there. And there are places and spaces and people locally to you, wherever you are, that your presence matters. And like you're saying, like, don't abandon those places. Don't give up on something that, go to the spaces where you are and where the healing needs to happen, and be part of the healing process. And those are there's such really powerful ideas. I love that you're integrating all that into a story. This is one of the reasons why your stories are so compelling to me, because they tackle all of this at once and sort of weave it together into this powerful images and emotional journeys, that make me want to find out what can I do where I am that will be present, will be restorative. How can my presence make a difference? And I think that's another disconnect that we get into a lot of times, especially with climate change, because it's so big and overwhelming, and it feels like we're so small and insignificant. But like your character on the beach, it will take a long time, and she will not be able to do all of the work herself. She even has the little mechanical tattooee to help her out, but she's there. She's making, a small difference is objectively different than zero. And if we each like lean into that and find our small differences, that like adds up in a serious hurry. I love that. All right. So I also want to point our readers or listeners, I guess, to your new short story collection that's coming out called Different Kinds of Defiance by Android Press. And that should be published by the time this episode airs, so people will be able to find it. And this is like a collection of all my favorite Renan Bernardo stories, plus a couple that are previously unpublished or only published in Portuguese. And first of all, I want to make sure that I was just looking at the table of contents. Is that an accurate read of what's going on with those stories?
Yeah. There will be 3 brand new stories, one of which was previously published in Portuguese.
Okay. Well, I can't wait to read those for sure. And even the ones, like, I haven't read all of them, but I think I'm hoping that listeners, when they're, hearing this episode and they're listening to what these stories are like, they will quickly become Renan Bernardo fans as well, because this is these stories do a lot of what I love to see climate fiction and solarpunk do. So I'm curious, and I know this is a terrible thing to ask, but like, which is your favorite story in the collection, or at least like, which one would you really like readers to check out and read? And can you tell us a little bit about it?
It's very hard to pick a favorite child,
Yes.
but I believe that I can mention The River That Passed Through My Life. It's the last story in the collection. It's the one that was previously published in Portuguese by Dami Blanche, which is a small press here in Brazil. And it's a climate fiction adventure set in the same Rio de Janeiro as When It's Time to Harvest and 8 Steps to Steal a Yacht and Build a Hospital. So they share the same universe. And this story is about a former teacher who won a lottery and left Rio to live in a space station that was built for the privileged. So basically, people fled to the space. They built some space station when they saw that the world was crumbling. The seats, most of the seats were undergoing some sort of collapse. Governments were failing, and so the rich built some space stations and fled to space. So this former teacher, she's called Naya, and she decides to come back to Rio to visit a dear friend. And then she gets a job with a rich girl who's trying to collect historical artifacts from before the collapse. So this one is very close to my heart, and people here in Brazil really enjoyed it. And this explains in greater detail how Rio de Janeiro came to be in that state that you can see in some of my stories, with the water level so high and the governments failing and the city collapsing and people trying to come up to it and fight for it and change the city the best way they can. So this story, it shows that it takes more than just climate to ruin a city. So it has this dark vein to it. It's a climate fiction story. I like to say that it's a climate fiction story verging to solarpunk. So you read my story When It's Time to Harvest. It's set in the same universe, but maybe 100 years in the future. So you can see a lot more hope in When It's Time to Harvest. That will also be in the collection. And then you would see in this story, The River That Passed Through My Life. But this story is essential, and it touches in some points that I think that are very important. Like that this character wants to come to Rio to bring something that she calls relics and back to space. But to who does these things belong? Does she think the people living in space have the right to come here and take back the things to them? Or does it belong to the people that are living here and making a difference right here? So this is one of the themes of the story.
It sounds amazing. I cannot wait to read it. And it brings up two things. First of all, I'm assuming that you wrote the Portuguese and the English versions. Like, you didn't let somebody else translate your Portuguese story into English, correct?
No,
Like,
yeah, correct. Yeah, it was
you
myself.
wrote it.
Yeah.
Okay. I would assume so. And thank you for doing that, because it's really important, I believe, for us in climate fiction to really get that wide diversity of stories, and not just, so readers who are reading in English tend to get a lot of stories that are set in English primarily speaking countries. That's kind of how that goes, and I get that. But we really need to especially in the climate fiction space, because it is not just an English speaking country phenomenon, right? Like stuff is happening everywhere, and we really need to have those different perspectives. And so people like yourself who are bilingual, who can bring those stories to us, or publishers who hire translators to, bring the stories to English, are doing a real service. I think they're really helping um, people in English speaking world or to understand at a more deep cultural level what is happening in different places. And it's in some ways every place is the same. Every place is going to have water and land and people and conflicts and governments and problems and pollution. Like everybody kind of has the same problems, but everybody has it in a different flavor. And that's another important message. I think that, yes, Rio de Janeiro in your fictional universe has problems that I'm sure the Gulf of Mexico, but off of Houston, has similar but different, right? Of course, the political systems are different and the people are different and the history is different. But at the same time, this idea of like, well, what who gives you the right to take things up to space from this local place? This local place has its own people and history. And, we if we're going to work local, that's another part of working local and recapturing that sense of place and connection to the land and connection to the history of your land, and to understand where your people are from, or whether maybe you're not from that. As you say, like a lot of abandonment is going to happen in climate change, as people, there are places that are just going to become less habitable, and so people are going to move, and there will be a lot of movement, a lot of displacement. So I think there will be a lot of people who will actually become unconnected to their homes, and that's like a whole nother piece of it. So there's so much richness in what we can explore with these stories. And I hope that, do you have a I got a sense, now I haven't read your entire biography, but I got a sense you have actually a lot of publications in Portuguese that have not been translated to English. Is that true? And will you be doing more of that in the future?
Yes, I have some, not that many, because I've been focused on writing in English for quite a few years. But I have some. I have one piece of climate fiction that was written in Portuguese and that I never translated to English and never published it also in Portuguese. It's completely unpublished. So that's one that I want to translate to English and try to publish it somewhere.
Yeah, I would love to see that as well. And I I love that you have been making such an effort. Again, thank you for like doing that sort of outreach to kind of have a presence in the English speaking science fiction world. And now, obviously you've won a Nebula. There's a few people that think that they like your work. So that's fantastic. And I hope we will be seeing more from you. But let me get to our my rapid round that I like to do at the end of our podcast of three rapid questions. So the first one is, what hopeful climate fiction have you read recently that you would recommend? And if it's in Portuguese, you can recommend that, but I might have to find like a translator. But and in English would probably be good too.
No, I actually thought of Kelsea. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but it's Kelsea Yu. It was a story called The Arc of Tomorrow, published at Clarkesworld. And it's a beautiful story about friendship and comfort, and about repairing a friendship that was jeopardized by one friend taking a comfortable job working for the rich people, and a rich company that hoarded a lot of food while part of the world starved. So That was a very beautiful and well-crafted story.
Nice. I will definitely put a link to that in our comments. So my next of the three is, what do you do to stay grounded and hopeful in our precarious and fast-changing world?
I believe that writing and reading. I believe it's these two things are the ones that keep me sane with all of what's happening. It's a way to keep myself in contact with my own thoughts and with the world. So it's kind of a cliche talking that in a podcast about writing, but I think writing and reading is what keeps me grounded and hopeful.
Sure. Now, do you read a lot of like Portuguese science fiction, or primarily English, or both, or what do
Both.
you both? Okay.
Yeah.
Do you, okay, so this is like a little bit off off topic, but
Yeah.
I'm curious now, like if you are seeing different trends in the Portuguese science fiction market, especially with regard to climate fiction. Like, is there a lot of solar punk being published in Portuguese, or is it primarily an English phenomenon? What's happening there?
Yeah, there are people that are venturing in Solarpunk here in Brazil, but I think that it's primarily an English phenomenon for now, and because we don't have that much variety of places to publish as well.
Mm.
We had a recent anthology that was published here. It was an anthology published also in English and Italian by Francisco Verso, and it came out in here in Portuguese last year. So that was, I think that was our second Solarpunk anthology published here. So we don't have that much of a tradition publishing climate fiction and Solarpunk, which is kind of sad because the first Solarpunk anthology was from here. It was published
Mhm.
in English by World Weaver Press, and it was a Brazilian anthology, but kind of maybe for many years that was the only one.
I had
So
forgotten about that, but yeah, now that you say that, I remembered. I think you mentioned that before in one of our other encounters. And yeah, that is kind of interesting how it started there. And I think the struggle is everywhere, to be honest, with finding venues that are open to these kinds of stories, willing to publish them, willing to get them out there. And it's a little bit of the struggle. And part
yeah,
of why, again, why the pod is in existence is I'm trying to help, build the audience in a sense for these stories by just reaching out to people and letting them know that it exists. And then maybe that will convince some of the larger publishers that, hey, look, there are actually people who want to read these stories. How about we publish more of them? So it's kind of a circular thing I'm trying to build with this. And, having your story, well, Conscious Chair is not, again, not explicitly climate fiction. However, people will discover you through that story being so visible, and then hopefully go back and read your body of work and find all these other stories. So I see that as a win, regardless of whether that particular story is solar punk. I don't know how you feel about that, or if you're seeing any of that where people are like, "Oh, I heard, I saw you on the Nebula list, and now I'm going and reading your other works." Are you seeing that happen?
yeah, that happens. Not only with the Nebula, but with other publications. Like maybe I have some story in Solarpunk magazine, and then people like it, and they go read it. Some of my other stories, and that happens a lot. Yeah,
Yeah, I believe it because your stories are amazing, and like I said, I'm a fan, so I can totally see how people, and I mean that's just how it works with fiction anyway, is you find an author who you really like, and then you go and read the rest of their stuff. So that's one way I hope to build, having people like yourself on the pod, um, build up a collection, a list of, you know authors that we've talked to, books that they recommend, books that they've written. And, if you like one of these, you're probably going to like some of the others on the list. And oftentimes that sort of discovery is the hardest thing for readers and writers, to find that next story that you're really, have a high probability that you're going to like this one too. So hopefully we will get some of that going as well. So last question. You got the Nebula nom, you've got a rash of new stories in the last year, you got this new short story collection coming out. You are just doing so many great things. What are you working on now, and what is coming next?
Actually, right now I'm not writing anything new. I'm revising a short story and kind of planning a new one, because just talking about the collection that will come out soon takes a lot of time. And also I'm campaigning for CFA members to vote on my novelette, A Short Biography of a Conscious Chair, in the final ballot of the Nebula. And just talking about these things takes a lot of time. You have to be all the time on social network and talking with people, and so I'm not really writing anything right now. I have a story that came out recently at Diabolical Plots. It's called The Offer of Peace Between Two Worlds. And also a story at Apex Magazine. Not those stories are not climate fiction, but they came out recently. And the one in Apex Magazine is called Complete Log of Week 893819, Dana's Story. It's a dark science fiction story. And I have a story at Reactor magazine. That one is kind of climate fiction. It's called The Plasticity of Being. It will come out at a Reactor, that store.com that changed the name. And it's about a company that exploited some people, developing an enzyme to make them digest plastic.
Oh, wow.
So the company wanted to end hunger in the world. But they exploited these people to create that enzyme, and then now these people are out there and they feed on plastic. So it's a very dark story also, and it touches on many elements of environmental and climate fiction.
Sounds amazing. I'm definitely going to be checking that one out as well. So one last question, sort of a follow on. Lots and lots of short stories, which I love, and also are really big in the Solarpunk space as well. Not as many novels. And I think part of that is because people aren't publishing the novels, and so less motivation to write them. But a lot of action going on in the short fiction space, which you're obviously doing. Have you been thinking about writing a novel? Have you written novels in this kind of climate fiction space, or is that a maybe future thing? What are your thoughts?
Not yet. I had some ideas that I had thought about, but I haven't developed them into longer stories yet. I've been quite focused on publishing short fiction for now. It's also a matter of time for me, because I think short fiction works best in my day-to-day. I have a day job, so I think short fiction for now works fine, but I have plans to write something longer, including climate fiction novel maybe.
Well, I would read the heck out of it. So put me down as one vote for a longer novel work from Renan Bernardo.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you for coming on the pod today. As usual, great conversation. And I really hope that our listeners will do themselves the treat of downloading some of your fiction and checking it out. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me here, Susan. And I can't wait to listen to the other guests on the Bright Moon Features. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you to Renan for joining us today. I encourage readers to check out his newly released collection, Different Kinds of Defiance. If you enjoyed this episode of Bright Green Futures, please subscribe and share it with your friends. For the month of May, I'm giving away copies of Little Blue Marbles, A World on Fire. Subscribe to be entered to win. The best way you can support the show is by reading and sharing the stories. You can find links to all the stories we reference at the Bright Green Futures Substack, as well as recommendations for more hopeful climate fiction. Next episode, I'll be talking about climate fiction in the larger climate movement and how understanding movement building can help our stories show how change really works. Bye for now. And remember to keep imagining the possibilities.